U.S. Attorney General Rick Coleman preaches a gospel of ironclad justice. He is the nation's top lawman, a symbol of order. But one phone call from a Georgia prison shatters his world. The voice is his estranged son, Darius, just sentenced to life by the very system his father commands. Suddenly, the man who sends criminals to prison must confront the boy he abandoned to one. To save his son, Rick must face his own hypocrisy and wage a secret war against the institution he swore to protect, a father's love versus a nation's laws. The air in courtroom 4B of the Fulton County Superior Courthouse was thick with the ghosts of past judgments. It smelled of old paper, cheap polish, and the faint, metallic tang of human anxiety. For 17-year-old Darius Coleman, it was the smell of the end of the world. He sat ramrod straight at the defendant's table, his ill-fitting suit, borrowed from his public defender, feeling like a costume for a play he never auditioned for. The fabric was stiff, the collar too tight, a constant, choking reminder of his confinement. Across the room, his mother, Angela Coleman, sat on a worn wooden bench, her hands clenched so tightly around a crumpled tissue that her knuckles were bone-white. She was a cardiology nurse, a woman accustomed to holding life in her hands, yet here she was, utterly powerless, watching her son's life slip through her fingers. Every sound was magnified. The squeak of a lawyer's shoe, the low hum of the fluorescent lights, the rhythmic tap of a journalist's pen against a notepad. But all of it was just background noise to the main event. Judge Harold Whitaker. Judge Whitaker was a man carved from granite and jurisprudence, with a shock of silver hair and a face set in lines of permanent disapproval. He surveyed his courtroom like a king surveying a flawed kingdom. He was a product of old Atlanta, a man who believed in the unassailable purity of the law, especially when applied with crushing force. In his world, there were no shades of gray, only the stark black and white of guilt and innocence, of order and chaos. And when he looked at Darius, he saw chaos. "The defendant will rise," the bailiff's voice boomed, and Darius felt his public defender, a tired but kind man named Thomas Levin, place a hand on his shoulder to steady him. Darius's legs felt like hollow reeds. He pushed himself up, his eyes instinctively finding his mother's. He saw the raw terror in her gaze, the silent scream she was holding back, and he had to look away, focusing instead on a crack in the plaster on the wall behind the judge's head. It looked like a lightning bolt, a tiny, frozen cataclysm. The crime was a robbery gone wrong, a stupid, desperate decision made with the wrong people on the wrong night. Darius wasn't the one who held the weapon, a fact the prosecution conveniently minimized. He was the driver, scared, panicked, and in way over his head. But under Georgia's felony murder statute, it didn't matter. The shop owner had a heart attack during the altercation and died. A life was lost, and the law demanded another in return. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat, the sound echoing like a tomb door sealing shut. He adjusted his spectacles, peering down at Darius as if examining a specimen under a microscope. "Darius Anthony Coleman," the judge began, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You stand before this court convicted of felony murder. A man is dead because of your actions. A family is shattered. A community is wounded. You and your associates acted with a callous disregard for human life, a cancer that this court has sworn to excise." Darius could feel the blood draining from his face. Cancer? He thought of the science fairs he'd won in middle school, the robotics club he'd captained, the future he'd once dreamed of. A future of coding and creating, not of cages and concrete. "You are young," Whitaker continued, "and the defense has argued for leniency on that basis. They speak of potential, of a life that could be redeemed. But this court must weigh that potential against the finality of the life that was extinguished. Potential is a luxury the victim, Mr. Cho, no longer has. No. Angela let out a small, strangled sob. A bailiff shot her a warning glance. Darius wanted to scream. He wanted to tell the judge about the nights he'd stayed up helping his mom study for her nursing recertification, about the part-time job he worked to help with the bills, about the fact that the so-called weapon was a broken pellet gun the other boy had brandished to look tough. But his throat was sealed shut with terror. The system had its narrative, and his truth was just an inconvenient footnote. The law is not a suggestion, Mr. Coleman. It is a bulwark against the darkness you chose to embrace that night, Whitaker said, his eyes like chips of ice. And it demands a commensurate response. It demands a message be sent, a line be drawn so clearly that others who might contemplate such actions will see the ruinous path they are choosing. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the silent room. This was his signature, the theatrical moment of gravity before the axe fell. Therefore, on the charge of felony murder, it is the sentence of this court that you, Darius Anthony Coleman, be committed to the custody of the Georgia Department of Corrections for the remainder of your natural life. Life. The word wasn't a word. It was a sound, a physical blow. It hit Darius in the chest, knocking the air from his lungs, the light from his eyes. The courtroom tilted, the faces of the jury blurring into a pale, indifferent smear. He heard a wail, a raw animal sound of pure agony, and realized it was his mother, her composure finally shattered. "No, God, no, not my boy!" she cried, lunging forward before being restrained by Mr. Levin's assistant. The gavel struck. Crack! The sound was final, absolute. The lightning bolt on the wall seemed to split wider. Hands were on him then, firm and impersonal. The bailiffs were cuffing him, their movements practiced and efficient. He was no longer Darius. He was an inmate, a number, a problem to be processed. He caught one last glimpse of his mother, her face a mask of utter devastation, before he was led through a side door, the heavy metal closing behind him with a deafening clang. The processing was a blur of fluorescent lights, echoing hallways, and the cold, indifferent touch of strangers. He was stripped, searched, and given a faded orange jumpsuit that smelled of bleach and despair. Every step was a descent, a peeling away of his identity, until nothing was left but a hollow shell of fear. Hours later, he was in a holding cell, the reality of his sentence crashing down on him in waves of nausea and terror. Life. He would grow old here. He would die here. He would never feel the sun on his face as a free man, never go to college, never fall in love, never give his mother the better life he had promised her. A guard appeared at the bars. "You get one phone call," he grunted, his face impassive. Darius's mind raced. His mother. He had to call his mother. But she was a wreck. What could she do? What could anyone do? Mr. Levin had already said an appeal was a long shot, almost impossible with a judge like Whitaker. And then, another thought surfaced. A desperate, last-resort idea he had pushed away for years. A name he rarely spoke. A connection he was both ashamed of and, in this final, desperate moment, clung to like a drowning man to a splinter of wood. His father. He hadn't seen him in person in 3 years. Their relationship existed only in sterile, perfunctory phone calls on birthdays and Christmas, calls that always felt more like an obligation than a connection. His father lived in a different universe, a world of power suits, motorcades, and national policy. A world that had no room for a son in a rough Atlanta neighborhood. Darius shuffled to the phone, mounted on the wall. His hands trembled as he took the receiver. He had the number memorized, a relic from a time when he still believed his father might one day come back. He punched in the digits, each beep a prayer. It was a private line, one he was only ever to use in a true emergency. "This qualifies," he thought with a bitter, hysterical laugh that died in his throat. The phone rang once. Twice. A crisp, professional voice answered. Office of the Attorney General. Darius's breath hitched. I need to speak with him. It's an emergency. Who is calling, please? He swallowed hard, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. Darius. Darius Coleman. I'm his son. There was a pause, a beat of hesitation that spoke volumes. The gatekeeper. He was being vetted. Then a click. Another voice came on the line. This one deeper, more commanding. A voice Darius had heard countless times on the news, but so rarely directed at him with any warmth. Darius, what is it? I'm in the middle of a briefing. The tone was impatient, strained. The dam inside Darius broke. The carefully constructed walls of pride and resentment crumbled, leaving only the terrified child within. Dad, he choked out, the word a sob. They gave me life. Silence. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the hum of the line, a vast, empty space between two worlds. Darius could picture him, standing in his cavernous, flag-adorned office in Washington, D.C., the city sprawling beneath him, a universe away from this cold, concrete box. Then, the voice again. But all the impatience was gone, replaced by a sudden, sharp intake of breath and a tone of chilling, utter disbelief. What did you say? They sentenced me, Darius repeated, tears streaming down his face now, hot and shameful. Judge Whitaker, in Atlanta. Dad, I got life in prison. On the other end of the line, Richard Rick Coleman, the 46th Attorney General of the United States, a man who had stared down cartels, terrorists, and hostile congressional committees without flinching, felt the world drop out from under his feet. His hand gripped the receiver so hard he thought the plastic might crack. He sank into his leather chair, his meticulously ordered universe, built on ambition, control, and a rigid definition of justice, shattering into a million pieces. His son, the boy he had left behind, the boy he had failed, was in prison for life, and the system that had just condemned him was the very system Rick Coleman was sworn, before God and country, to lead. The silence that stretched across the phone line was a chasm, separating a sterile, mahogany-paneled office in Washington, D.C., from a cinder-block-holding cell in Atlanta. In that chasm lay 15 years of distance, broken promises, and the vast, unspoken grief between a father and a son. For Rick Coleman, the world had just tilted on its axis. The briefing papers on his desk, detailing national security threats and intricate legal strategies, suddenly seemed like meaningless artifacts from another life. He stared out his floor-to-ceiling window at the Washington Monument, a stark white spear against the bruised twilight sky, but he didn't see it. He saw a gap-toothed 5-year-old boy on a rusty swing set, pumping his legs and shouting, "Higher, Daddy, higher!" Darius, he finally managed to say, his voice a hoarse whisper. Start from the beginning. Tell me everything. As Darius's story tumbled out, a torrent of fear, confusion, and regret about the robbery, the other boys, the pellet gun, the trial, Rick felt a cold dread seep into his bones. It was a classic case of a young man from a marginalized neighborhood being swallowed whole by the unforgiving gears of the justice system. A story he had heard 1,000 times. He had built a career on such stories, using them as examples in speeches about the need for law and order, for holding individuals accountable for the chaos they create. He was the tough-on-crime AG, the man who believed in personal responsibility above all else. But this wasn't an abstract talking point. This was Darius, his son. The boy whose first steps he'd missed because he was closing a career-making case in Chicago. The boy whose high school graduation he would now miss because his son would be wearing a prison uniform instead of a cap and gown. The call ended with Darius's voice cracking, telling him Thomas Levin's name and that his mother was there. Then the line went dead, cut off by the prison's timer. Rick was left holding a silent receiver, the dial tone a mocking hum. He slammed the phone down, a sudden violent crack of sound in the funereal quiet of his office. His chief of staff, a sharp, politically savvy woman named Celeste Park, poked her head in. "Sir, is everything all right?" Rick waved a dismissive hand, unable to form words. He was two men at war with each other inside the same tailored suit. There was Rick Coleman, the Attorney General, whose mind was already calculating the political fallout. The media frenzy, the accusations of interference, the calls for his resignation, a sitting AG's son, convicted of murder. It was a political firebomb. His entire career, his life's work, was balanced on a knife's edge. Then there was Rick Coleman, the father. A failed, absentee father, but a father nonetheless. And that man was screaming. That man saw the face of his son, heard the terror in his voice, and felt a primal, protective rage that threatened to consume everything else. "Cancel my next meeting," he said, his voice strained. "Get me everything you can on a Judge Harold Whitaker in Fulton County, Georgia, and find a case file. The state of Georgia versus Darius Anthony Coleman." Celeste's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of understanding and alarm. She knew of his son, of course, but only as a distant, biographical detail. "Sir, may I ask—" "Just do it, Celeste," he snapped, then immediately regretted his tone. He ran a hand over his face, the exhaustion of the past few minutes feeling like a physical weight. "Please, just get me the information." As Celeste quietly retreated, Rick walked to the wet bar tucked into a corner of his office and poured a glass of water, his hand shaking. He looked at his reflection in the polished wood. He saw the man who had dined with presidents, who had reshaped American law, who was on the short list for a Supreme Court nomination. And for the first time, he saw a coward. He had let his ambition be the excuse. When he and Angela had separated, it was acrimonious. She had accused him of loving his career more than his family, and she wasn't wrong. He had moved to D.C., climbing the ladder with ferocious intensity, telling himself it was for the best, that Darius was better off in a stable environment with his mother, away from the political shark tank. He sent money, more than enough to ensure Darius had every material thing he needed. But he hadn't sent himself. He'd traded scraped knees and parent-teacher conferences for press conferences and policy memos. He had convinced himself that providing for his son was the same as being there for him. He had built a fortress of power and prestige around himself, and now he realized it was a prison of its own. Meanwhile, in the harsh, fluorescent-lit waiting area of the Fulton County Jail, Angela Coleman was living her own private nightmare. The initial, gut-wrenching wail in the courtroom had subsided into a state of numb shock. Mr. Levin had guided her out, his face etched with a familiar, weary sympathy he reserved for the families of the condemned. "We'll file an appeal, Angela," he said, his voice gentle. "Whitaker is tough, but the sentence is extreme for a first-time offender who wasn't the primary aggressor. We can argue sentencing disparity, ineffective assistance of counsel if we have to." Angela barely heard him. The legal jargon was a foreign language. The only words that registered were life in prison. They echoed in her mind, a death knell for the future she had envisioned for her son. Darius, the boy who used to build intricate Lego cities that covered the entire living room floor. Darius, who could take apart a computer and put it back together by the time he was 12. Darius, who would sit with her after a grueling 12-hour shift and massage her aching feet. Her boy, her sweet, brilliant boy, gone. She felt a vibration in her purse and fumbled for her phone. The screen lit up with a name that made her heart seize with a fresh wave of anger and pain. Rick Coleman. She hadn't spoken to him in months. Their last conversation had been a stilted, tense argument over Darius's summer plans. She wanted Darius to get a local internship. Rick had offered to pay for a prestigious and distant coding camp, another attempt to solve a problem with money. She rejected the call, her thumb stabbing at the screen. Let him leave a voicemail. Let him stew in the silence he had created. He didn't deserve to hear her voice, to share in this grief he had no right to. He hadn't been here for the arrest, the arraignment, the sleepless nights, the endless meetings with the public defender. He hadn't sat on that hard wooden bench for 3 days, watching the prosecution paint their son as a monster. But a moment later, the phone rang again. Persistent, demanding. With a shaking hand, she answered, her voice low and venomous. "What do you want, Rick?" "Angela, I just spoke to him." The voice on the other end was stripped of its usual authority. It was just a man's voice, ragged with shock. "A little late for that, don't you think?" She shot back, the bitterness a dam breaking. "Where were you when he was sitting in that courtroom, scared out of his mind? Where were you when that judge called our son a cancer? Oh, that's right. You were in Washington playing God." "Angela, please," he begged, and the raw desperation in his tone gave her a moment's pause. "I didn't know. He never told me how serious it was. I swear to you. He didn't tell you because you haven't been his father in a decade, Rick. You're a name on a check, a voice on the phone for his birthday. You don't get to call now and act like you care." The tears she'd been holding back began to fall, hot and angry. "They gave him life. Life, Rick. They've taken my baby and you weren't even here." She could hear him breathing on the other end, a ragged, unsteady sound. "I'm getting on the first flight," he said, his voice firming, the Attorney General resurfacing. "I'm going to fix this." A hysterical laugh escaped Angela's lips. "Fix this? You can't fix this. This isn't one of your political problems you can solve with a press conference. This is Darius's life. You can't just wave your magic wand and make the bars disappear. Your power, your ambition, that's what broke this family in the first place. It can't be what puts it back together." "I know," he said, and the simple, broken admission stunned her into silence. "I know I failed him. I failed you. But I am still his father, and I will not let him rot in that place. I don't know how yet, but I will not let this stand." Angela sank onto a cold plastic chair, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. For the first time in a long time, she didn't hear the politician. She heard the man she had once loved, the man who had held Darius in his arms on the day he was born and promised to always protect him, a promise he had broken, but a promise he was, at last, trying to keep. "He's at the county jail," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They'll move him to the state diagnostic prison in Jackson in a few days." "I'm on my way," Rick said, and the line clicked dead. Angela stared at her phone, her heart a tangled mess of fury and a tiny, treacherous flicker of hope. The Attorney General was coming. The powerful man who had abandoned them was flying to the rescue. But she wondered if he truly understood what he was up against. It wasn't just a biased judge or a flawed case. It was a system that Rick Coleman himself had championed. A system that was now about to test the limits of his power, his conscience, and his long-dormant love for his son. The Gulfstream G5550, an aircraft accustomed to carrying senators and foreign dignitaries, cut through the night sky like a silver dart. Inside, Rick Coleman sat alone in the plush leather cabin, a fortress of solitude at 40,000 feet. The case file for the state of Georgia versus Darius Anthony Coleman, couriered to him with breathtaking speed, lay open on the polished table before him. The stark, black-and-white text was a brutal indictment, not just of his son, but of his own neglect. He read through the police reports, the witness statements, the prosecutor's arguments. He saw the strategy immediately. They had isolated Darius, portraying him as the cold, calculating wheelman, the one who made the crime possible. They'd downplayed his age and his clean record, focusing instead on the neighborhood he lived in, using it as a form of circumstantial evidence. It was a textbook prosecution, efficient and ruthless. And, from a purely legal standpoint, it was airtight. The felony murder rule was an iron cage. It didn't matter that Darius didn't intend for anyone to die. It didn't matter that he wasn't even in the store. He was a participant in a felony that resulted in a death, and in the eyes of the law, that made him a murderer. It was a law Rick himself had defended publicly as a necessary tool for prosecutors. He felt a wave of self-loathing so intense it made him dizzy. He had championed the very legal architecture that was now crushing his son. When the jet landed at a private airfield outside Atlanta, a black government-issue SUV was waiting on the tarmac. There was no motorcade, no fanfare. He had insisted on absolute discretion. As the car sped through the sleeping suburbs, Rick felt like a foreigner in the city where his son had grown up. The familiar street names were just signposts to a life he hadn't been a part of. His first stop was not the jail, but a sterile, all-night coffee shop where a weary-looking Thomas Levin was waiting for him. The public defender's eyes widened in disbelief as the Attorney General of the United States slid into the booth opposite him. "Mr. Attorney General," Levin stammered, fumbling with his glasses. I had no idea." "He didn't want anyone to know," Rick said, his voice flat. "It wouldn't have helped. It might have made it worse." He cut straight to the point. "The appeal. What are our real chances?" Levin sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "Honestly, slim to none. Judge Whitaker has one of the highest affirmance rates in the state. He builds his sentences like a fortress. The DA's office will fight it tooth and nail. An appeal could take years, and the odds of getting the conviction overturned are astronomical. What about the sentence itself? Life for a 17-year-old driver?" "It's draconian, but it's not illegal," Levin said, his voice laced with the frustration of a man who fought these battles every day. "Whitaker will argue it's a deterrent. The appellate court rarely interferes with a judge's sentencing discretion unless there's a clear abuse, and this, technically, falls within the statutory guidelines." Rick felt a door slam shut in his mind. The legal, by-the-book route was a dead end. He was the nation's chief law enforcement officer. He couldn't be seen to be pulling strings, pressuring judges, or subverting the very process he was sworn to protect. The political fallout would be catastrophic, not just for him, but for the entire administration. It would be framed as a gross abuse of power, the ultimate act of elite hypocrisy. He would have to find another way, a way through the cracks. The next morning, Rick stood outside the Fulton County Jail, stripped of his title and his power. He was just a man on a visitor's list, waiting to see his son. When Darius was finally led into the visitation room, the sight of him shattered what little composure Rick had left. The ill-fitting suit was gone, replaced by a baggy, faded orange jumpsuit with FCJ stenciled on the back. Darius's face was pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes. He looked younger and more vulnerable than ever, a boy drowning in clothes made for a hardened man. They sat opposite each other, a thick pane of plexiglass between them, and spoke through crackling phones. The conversation was stilted, a minefield of guilt and unspoken accusations. "I'm sorry," Rick began, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. "Darius, I am so sorry." Darius just stared at him, his expression unreadable. "For what? For not being here? Or for the laws you helped write that put me here?" The question was a dagger, and it found its mark. "Both," Rick said, his voice raw. "God, for both." He tried to talk about legal strategy, about hope, but Darius wasn't interested. "Mom said you were going to fix this," Darius said, a bitter edge to his voice. "How? You gonna call the governor? Pardon me yourself? Isn't that a conflict of interest, Mr. Attorney General?" "Don't," Rick pleaded. "Please, just let me try. I let you down. I know that. I have spent years letting you down, but I'm here now. You're here now because I'm in here for life." Darius shot back, his voice rising. "You weren't here for my 15th birthday. You weren't here when I won the state science fair. You weren't here when my appendix burst and Mom had to sit with me in the hospital for 2 days straight. But a life sentence? Yeah, that gets Rick Coleman on a plane." Every word was true. Every accusation was earned. Rick had no defense. He could only sit there and take it, the plexiglass a perfect metaphor for the barrier he had built between them. He left the jail feeling more defeated than ever. He met Angela in the parking lot. She looked as though she had aged 5 years overnight. "How is he?" she asked, her voice brittle. "He's angry," Rick replied. "He has every right to be." "Yes, he does," she said, her gaze unflinching. "So what's the plan, Rick? What miracle are you going to perform?" The sarcasm was a shield, protecting a heart that had been broken too many times. "The legal channels are a dead end," he admitted. "An appeal is a lottery ticket. I can't interfere directly. It would destroy any chance he has and probably get him targeted inside." Angela's face fell, the tiny flicker of hope she'd harbored finally extinguishing. "So, that's it? You came all the way down here to tell me there's nothing you can do?" "No," Rick said, a new steely resolve in his voice. "I came down here to tell you that the law has failed. So we have to go around it. We have to reinvestigate this entire case from scratch. The public defender's office is overworked and underfunded. They did their best, but they didn't have the resources. I do." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for a truce, for a chance. "I can't be the Attorney General right now, and God knows I haven't been a very good father, but I used to be a damn good lawyer. Let me do that. Let me fight for our son, not with power, but with the truth. We have to find something the police and the prosecution missed. A witness who wasn't interviewed, a piece of evidence that was ignored, something." Angela searched his face, looking for the ambitious politician she had come to despise. But she saw something else there now. Fear, desperation, and a glimmer of the man she had first fallen in love with. The passionate, brilliant young lawyer who believed that justice was something you fought for, not something you were given. "What do you need?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Everything," Rick said. "I need every friend Darius has, every text message from that week, every detail he ever told you about the other boys, about what happened before and after. We're going to build a new narrative, the one that should have been told in that courtroom." He made a call, not to a government agency, but to a private number. "Maya, it's Rick Coleman," he said, his voice low. "I have a case for you. It's personal. I need the best investigator you know, and I need you to be the most ruthless, cynical, and brilliant appellate attorney in the country. The client is my son." He was stepping into a new arena. Not as the Attorney General, but as a father with unlimited resources and a single, desperate goal. He was about to declare a private war on a case that had already been closed against a system he helped to build. It was a dangerous, high-stakes gamble, and he had no idea if it would save his son or simply drag them all down with him. But for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his career or his legacy. He was thinking about a boy on a swing set, shouting, "Higher, Daddy, higher!" And this time, Rick Coleman was determined not to let him fall. Maya Sanderson was a force of nature disguised as a lawyer. Sharp, skeptical, and utterly unintimidated by Rick Coleman's title, she set up a war room in a discreet Atlanta office suite. She and a hand-picked team of investigators, including a grizzled ex-homicide detective named Isaac Moreno, began to deconstruct the state's case, piece by painful piece. While they worked, Rick embarked on a different, more difficult kind of investigation, rebuilding the bridge to his family. His visits with Darius in the now permanent setting of the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison were excruciating. The plexiglass was gone, but the emotional barrier remained. Rick stopped talking about legal strategy and started talking about his own failings. He told Darius about the crushing pressure he'd felt as a young black lawyer trying to outrun the shadow of low expectations. He confessed his fear that getting too close to his son's life in a rough neighborhood would somehow tarnish the perfect, sterile image he was trying to project to the world. It wasn't an excuse, he told Darius, but it was the truth. I was a coward, Rick said, his voice thick with emotion during one visit. I thought power would protect me, protect you, but it just isolated me. I see that now. Darius listened, his silence a wall Rick kept trying to scale. Simultaneously, Rick and Angela formed a fragile alliance. They spent hours together in the war room, poring over Darius's life. Angela provided the context Isaac Moreno's investigation needed, the slang in the text messages, the dynamics between the boys, the fear Darius had expressed about a local gang leader who the other boys were trying to impress. For the first time in years, they were a team, united by a singular purpose. The anger between them didn't vanish, but it was overshadowed by their shared love for their son. The breakthrough came from the most mundane of sources, a city zoning application. Isaac, chasing down a hunch about the crime scene, discovered that the convenience store next to the one that was robbed had applied for a permit to install a new high-resolution security system just weeks before the incident. It was a camera that wasn't on the original police report, because it wasn't pointed at the victim's store. It was pointed down the alleyway where Darius had been waiting in the car. Maya's team filed a subpoena. After a week of legal wrangling, they got the footage. In the war room, they watched the grainy, time-stamped video. It showed Darius's beat-up sedan pulling into the alley. Then it showed something else. A second car, a dark sedan, pulling in behind him, blocking him in. A man got out of the second car and spoke to the other two boys, the ones who went into the store. This man was the local gang leader Angela had mentioned. He was the one who handed the pellet gun to the main aggressor. He was the architect. The footage showed Darius arguing with the other boys, clearly agitated. It showed him trying to back his car out, only to be blocked. He wasn't just the getaway driver. He was a pawn, trapped and coerced. The prosecution's narrative of a cold, calculated participant crumbled. This was evidence of duress. "This is it," Maya said, her voice electric. "This is the crack in the wall." The motion for a new trial, based on new evidence, landed on Judge Whitaker's desk like a grenade. The Fulton County DA's office fought it furiously, accusing the defense of a fishing expedition funded by DC money. The media, catching wind of the high-powered legal team, began to circle. The hearing was held in the same courtroom, 4B. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. Rick and Angela sat together, a united front. Darius, in his prison jumpsuit, looked not with terror but with a flicker of hope. Maya Sanderson was magnificent. She didn't just play the video. She dismantled the original investigation, showing how the police had suffered from tunnel vision, focusing only on the boys they caught and ignoring evidence of a wider conspiracy. Isaac Moreno testified about the gang leader's known history of using juveniles to commit crimes. The prosecutor argued that Darius still made a choice. He still drove the car. He made a choice under duress, with his exit blocked, and a known violent criminal orchestrating the event, Maya countered, her voice ringing with conviction. The state didn't just withhold exculpatory evidence, they failed to look for it. They saw a car of black teenagers from a poor neighborhood and filled in the blanks with a story they already believed. The truth, Your Honor, was in this alleyway the whole time. All eyes turned to Judge Whitaker. He sat, impassive as ever, staring at the frozen image of the gang leader on the screen. He could have dismissed the motion. He could have protected the original verdict, his own judgment. It would have been the easy way out. But as he looked from the screen to Darius, he didn't just see a defendant. He saw the face of a boy his own system had railroaded. He saw the crack in the wall, not just in the case, but in his own rigid certainty. He cleared his throat. For a conviction to stand, it must be built on a foundation of truth. It has become clear to this court that the foundation of this particular conviction is, at best, incomplete, and at worst, fundamentally flawed. He looked directly at Darius. "The motion for a new trial is granted. The previous verdict and sentence are hereby vacated." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Angela burst into tears, but this time they were tears of overwhelming relief. Rick wrapped an arm around her, his own eyes shining. Darius stared at the judge, his mouth agape, as the bailiffs came not to lead him back to a cell, but to begin the process of his release. Weeks later, after the DA, facing a public relations nightmare and a now unwinnable case, dropped all charges against Darius in exchange for his testimony against the gang leader, Darius walked out of the Fulton County Jail, a free man. The first thing he did was hug his mother, a long, desperate embrace that said everything words could not. Then, he turned to Rick. The space between them was no longer filled with anger or plexiglass. "Thank you," Darius said, his voice thick. "I should have been there sooner," Rick replied, his own voice breaking. "I promise you, from now on, I will be." He didn't offer a handshake. He pulled his son into a hug, burying his face in Darius's shoulder, a father finally holding the child he had almost lost forever. A month later, Rick Coleman stood at a podium in the Department of Justice. He wasn't there to announce a new indictment or policy. He was there to tell a story. He told the nation about his son, not sparing his own failures as a father or the system's failures in its pursuit of justice. "We cannot let zip codes and stereotypes write the story for our children," he said, his voice steady and strong. "The law should be a shield for the vulnerable, not just a sword against the accused. My son's case has shown me that we can, and we must, do better. My personal journey as a father has now become my public mission as Attorney General." That evening, far from the cameras and the press, the Coleman family was just a family. Rick, Angela, and Darius sat on the back porch of Angela's small house, the air filled with the sound of crickets. The broken family wasn't magically healed, but it was healing. The wounds were deep, but they were no longer festering in silence. Darius was looking at brochures for Georgia Tech. Angela was smiling, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. And Rick was just there, present, listening to his son talk about a future that was no longer a stolen dream. He had entered this crisis as the U.S. Attorney General, a man defined by his power. But he emerged from it as something far more important, something he had been all along but had forgotten how to be. A father. The journey had stripped him of his arrogance and his ambition, leaving behind something more resilient, more profound. He learned that true strength wasn't found in the cold letter of the law, but in the fierce, messy, and unbreakable bonds of love. And that the most powerful position in the world meant nothing without the authenticity of the human spirit to guide it. In the end, this wasn't a story about a powerful man saving his son. It was about a son saving his father from a prison of his own making. It's a powerful reminder that our titles and our successes mean nothing if we lose the ones we love. The human spirit, when fueled by love and a fight for the truth, can find a crack in even the most formidable walls and let the light in. Justice, redemption, and family are worth fighting for, no matter the odds. What did you think of Rick's and Darius's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you and you believe in the power of second chances, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more true-to-life stories that touch the heart. Thank you for watching.